Welcome to the deep dive. Today, we are taking a necessary plunge into the politics of America's Gilded Age. You know, that roughly 50-year stretch right after the Civil War,
Mhm.
it's marked by just colossal wealth, explosive industrial growth, and, well, frankly, some pretty staggering political dysfunction.
Absolutely. It's a period full of contradictions.
So our mission today is really to distill the key forces at play during this, let's face it, kind of confusing era. The big question is, how did a time defined by such immense private fortune and corporate power also manage to breed both extreme government corruption and these really powerful, almost radical movements demanding governmental upheaval?
Yeah, and we've got sources that lay out the blueprint. We're looking at everything from how parties relied on patronage, giving out jobs.
Right, the spoils system.
Exactly, all the way to the really revolutionary calls coming from the populace later on.
And when you first dive into this period, what's immediately clear, looking at the sources, is this core paradox, isn't it?
It really is. Gilded Age politics, it was characterized by an almost a religious belief in a hands-off approach to governance.
Hands off, meaning.
Meaning the major parties often saw their main role not as, say, solving these huge new economic problems created by industrialization, but more as just managing power itself, winning elections, controlling appointments.
Right, okay.
And that specific kind of legislative inertia, that inaction, it simultaneously encouraged widespread corruption and legislative paralysis. It sort of created a vacuum.
Okay, let's unpack that political baseline then.
Yeah.
Starting with the two major parties. If you were living back then, say the 1870s or 80s, your political loyalty was largely determined by the Civil War, wasn't it? Those loyalties lingered.
Oh, absolutely. The sources confirm that the main goal for both parties was often just winning elections to distribute federal jobs through patronage. That old spoil system was still very much the engine driving things.
So the parties were almost like these regional armies defined by those Civil War loyalties.
That's a good way to put it. The Republican Party, for instance, was dominant in the North and the Midwest. This was the party of, well, Union veterans, obviously. Also, newly enfranchised black voters, at least initially.
And business interests too, right?
Increasingly so, yes. Middle-class businessmen, Protestants, they were a key part of that coalition.
And policy-wise, what were their main pillars?
Okay, key platforms. High protective tariffs, absolutely crucial for shielding that growing northern manufacturing base, and staunch support for the gold standard. These were policies that definitely pleased the creditor and industrial classes.
Got it. Then you flip the coin, you have the Democratic Party, anchored firmly where?
Primarily in the South, the former Confederacy. Their platform often centered on states' rights and, unfortunately, racial segregation.
But they also had a base in the North.
They did, particularly among northern urban immigrants, think Irish, Germans in the big cities. Policy-wise, they generally supported lower tariffs. But a key thing to remember is they were constantly fractured by internal fights over economic policy, especially currency. We'll definitely get into that.
So the big takeaway for both parties at this stage, structure was built around rewarding loyalty, not necessarily competence, through this spoils system.
Precisely. Allocating jobs based on who you knew, who you supported.
And that system was just deeply, deeply entrenched. As our sources show, it really took something truly shocking to even begin to crack it open.
You're talking about Garfield's assassination.
Yeah, 1881. President James Garfield shot by a disgruntled office seeker, someone who felt they were owed a government job through patronage.
It was this horrible, stark event, and it immediately exposed the dangers, frankly, the absurdity of unchecked patronage. It became a catalyst for change.
Right. It led directly to the Pendleton Civil Service Act in 1883.
Which introduced competitive exams for certain federal jobs. It was a move toward a merit-based system away from pure patronage. On paper, a big win for reform.
But, and this is such a crucial point from the sources, we need to pause here.
Yeah.
Because this act, while aiming for reform, had this massive unintended consequence, didn't it?
Huge. With parties now blocked, or at least partially blocked, from distributing federal jobs as rewards, the whole mechanism of political fundraising had to change radically.
It wasn't just like a minor tweak.
No. It was a fundamental structural shift in how parties got funded. They needed cash to run campaigns, to maintain their organizations. Where would they get it now?
Not from promising little post office jobs anymore.
Exactly. So the source of power almost instantaneously shifted away from distributing those small government jobs and towards relying heavily on large financial contributions from wealthy individuals and corporations.
Just think about that for a second, you, the listener. Before Pendleton, Maybe your congressman listened most closely to the local party boss who controlled the jobs back home.
Right.
After 1883, that same congressman is suddenly much more reliant on, say, the railroad magnate or the factory owner who's writing the big campaign check.
It fundamentally altered who politicians listened to, what legislative agendas they pursued. It really laid the groundwork for the deep corporate influence that became such a defining feature of the rest of the Gilded Age.
And this new funding system, it helps explain that legislative inertia you mentioned earlier, doesn't it?
It does. The new financiers, the big donors, they generally didn't want radical change. They wanted stability, predictable policies that favored their interests, high tariffs, the gold standard, things that maintained the status quo that benefited them.
Okay, speaking of those big policy fights, let's transition from the mechanics of patronage to the great economic debates that really define the period. Because the issues of money and trade, they truly split the country.
Yeah, this is where things get really heated. And we absolutely have to start with the currency debate. This epic battle between sticking to the gold standard versus the push for free silver or bimetallism.
All right, so let's break that down. If I'm an industrialist, a banker, maybe someone who lends money, a creditor, I'm a gold bug. Why is sticking only to gold so important for me?
Well, primarily because it kept the money supply restricted, tied to the amount of gold the government physically held. This ensured a stable, limited currency.
Stable meaning.
Stable meaning it limited inflation. If you're a creditor lending out money, that's vital. You want the money you get paid back to be worth at least the same, or ideally more than the money you lent out. Gold standard helped ensure that. But it also created strong deflationary pressure.
Okay, explain that deflationary impact. Because that's the mechanism that just hammered farmers and debtors.
Right? Exactly. Think about it. The money supply is restricted, tied to gold. But at the same time, American farms and factories are becoming incredibly productive, churning out more and more goods.
So more stuff, same amount of money chasing it.
Precisely. The result, prices fall. That's deflation.
So let's make it concrete. If I'm a farmer, maybe I took out a loan, say $10,000, back when my wheat sold for $1 a bushel. Now, because of this deflation, prices have dropped. Wheat's only fetching 50 cents a bushel. But my debt is still fixed at $10,000.
Right. So suddenly you have to grow and sell twice as much wheat just to make the same fixed loan payment. You're being squeezed.
Strangled, yeah, by fixed debt and falling prices for what I produce.
That's it, exactly. The actual value of their debt was increasing relative to their income. And this is why farmers, debtors, many small entrepreneurs, they just fiercely advocated for the free coinage of silver.
They wanted the government to start minting silver coins, too, alongside gold.
Yes, bimetallism. They desperately needed to expand the money supply, to inject more currency into the economy, hoping it would stop deflation and maybe even cause a little inflation.
Because inflation would lower the real value of their debts, make repayment easier. It felt like their only economic lifeline.
It really did. And that sense of desperation, that struggle, it found a powerful national voice in William Jennings Bryan. He championed the cause of silver.
Integrating those agrarian concerns right into the national spotlight, especially with his famous Cross of Gold speech in 1896.
A defining moment, absolutely. He argued that sticking only to gold was crucifying the farmer and the laborer.
Okay, now let's quickly pivot to the other huge economic fight. Tariffs. Protective tariffs. These were bedrock Republican policy, right? Protect American industries from cheaper foreign goods. Seems simple enough on the surface.
It does, shielding those burgeoning domestic industries, particularly in the North, from foreign competition.
But the opposition was huge. Who was fighting against high tariffs?
Well, farmers, again, massively, and consumers generally. High tariffs essentially acted like a tax on consumers, didn't they? They raised the prices of goods, both imported and domestic.
Right, because domestic producers could charge more if foreign competition was priced out.
Exactly. But for the farmer, it was often worse. They argued, pretty convincingly, that these high tariffs provoked retaliatory trade barriers from other countries.
So other countries would slap tariffs on American agricultural exports.
Precisely.
Right.
Which severely harmed the farmers' ability to sell their crops overseas, a market they desperately needed. So they felt squeezed from both sides, low prices at home due to deflation and blocked markets abroad due to tariffs.
Wow, okay, so this combination, deflation, crushing debt, punitive tariffs, it creates this perfect economic storm, this pressure cooker.
Which leads us directly to the rise of one of the most remarkable and maybe misunderstood political movements in American history, populism.
Yeah, when the established parties, Republicans and Democrats, basically failed to address this deepening economic suffering, especially for farmers.
agrarian activism just boiled over. It culminated in the formation of the People's Party, or the Populists as we know them. And this wasn't just some minor third party, it was a direct, radical challenge to the concentrated corporate power that seemed to dominate the era.
And when you actually look at their core document, the Omaha Platform of 1892, you realize just how, well, revolutionary their demands were for that time. They were proposing massive governmental intervention in the economy.
Oh, they absolutely threw down the gauntlet. The platform called for a fundamental rethinking, a redefinition of the government's role. They demanded things like the federal government taking ownership of railroads and telegraphs.
Whoa. In the 1890s, that
Very
sounds.
shockingly socialist, right? To the elites of the time, absolutely. It was seen as incredibly radical.
What else was in there,
Mm.
besides tackling the railroads?
Well, they obviously repeated that key demand for the unlimited coinage of silver to fight deflation, and they proposed a graduated income tax.
Meaning the wealthy should pay a higher percentage of their income in taxes. Another pretty radical idea for the 1890s.
Definitely. And significantly, they also focused on political reforms, wanting to give more power directly back to the citizens.
How so?
They demanded the direct election of U.S. senators. At the time, senators were chosen by state legislatures, which were often seen as corrupt or controlled by corporate interests.
So take that power away from the back rooms and give it to the people directly.
Exactly. And they also push for things like initiatives and referendums mechanisms that allow citizens to propose and vote on laws directly. They were really asking for deep structural reforms that were, frankly, decades ahead of their time.
It's easy now maybe to dismiss them as just a fringe group of angry farmers, but their influence was actually huge, wasn't it? Culminating in William Jennings Bryan essentially adopting large parts of their platform in his 1896 presidential run.
He did. He fused the Democratic Party with many populist ideas, particularly on silver. But what's also really compelling, and something our sources highlight that's often overlooked, is their attempt, however fraught and ultimately difficult, to bridge deep racial divides.
How did that work?
Well, you see figures like John B. Rayner, who was an African-American populist leader down in Texas. He actively worked to try and forge interracial coalitions among poor black and white farmers.
Based on shared economic hardship.
Exactly. Arguing that the same economic system, the same banks, the same railroads were exploiting both groups. Now, this was incredibly difficult, almost impossible in the fiercely segregated Jim Crow South.
Of course.
But it showed that when economic hardship gets severe enough, it can, at least briefly, challenge even the most entrenched political and social orders by potentially uniting people at the bottom across racial lines. A powerful, if fleeting, idea.
Okay, let's shift focus now. We've talked about national debates, big economic forces, radical movements. Let's zoom out from the wheat fields and the halls of Congress and look at the rapidly growing American cities. Because here, politics operated on a completely different set of rules, didn't it?
Yeah.
Dominated by these things called political machines.
Yeah. This is where we see local power operating at its most, its most transactional. And you could argue sometimes it's most effective in a strange way. We're talking about machines like the famous Tammany Hall.
New York City's powerful Democratic organization, run for a long time by the infamous Boss Tweed.
That's the archetype. And the corruption here was, it was open. It was notorious. These political bosses maintained their power by controlling pretty much every aspect of urban life they could touch.
Like what?
Controlling municipal jobs, city contracts for building things, openly engaging in vote buying, and, yes, sometimes embezzling public funds on a just staggering scale. Boss Tweed being the prime example.
Okay, so that's the corrupt negative side. Pretty clear.
That's the first half of the story, absolutely, and it's pretty indefensible. But, and this is the critical counter perspective you absolutely need to understand from the sources, despite that blatant corruption, these machines were often the only organizations providing essential services to many urban residents, especially the poor and immigrants.
So wait, they were corrupt, but they were also acting like a sort of crude social safety net.
In many ways, yes. Think about it. A newly arrived Irish immigrant family lands in New York. They need housing, maybe some food to tide them over, help navigating the legal system, and most importantly, they need a job, probably manual labor.
And the official city government, or the state, or federal government
Was largely indifferent or incapable of providing that kind of direct personal assistance, but Tammany Hall, the local precinct captain, they stepped in. They might control access to jobs on city construction projects. They might provide a bag of coal in the dead of winter, or intervene with a judge if someone got into minor trouble, or hand out a turkey at Thanksgiving.
So even while Boss Tweed might be skimming millions off inflated city contracts,
His lieutenants, down on the street level, were delivering tangible benefits to the people in their neighborhoods, people who were getting very little help from anywhere else.
which creates this incredibly complex, kind of mutually beneficial system, right?
Exactly. The community, especially immigrant communities like the Irish in New York, delivered reliable, loyal votes for the machine, block voting.
And in exchange,
In exchange, they got access to power, however limited. They got assistance navigating this otherwise brutal, unequal urban structure. The machine, in a way, ensured their survival, or at least made survival easier.
they successfully negotiated access to resources, jobs, favors, that the formal Gilded Age political structure that paralyzed, hands-off structure we talked about, was either too gridlocked or too unwilling to provide to the marginalized.
That exchange necessities and favors for loyalty and votes, that's the key to understanding why these machines were so powerful and so resilient. Even against waves of reform attempts, they were actually doing things for people, even if corruptly.
Okay, so let's try and pull this all together for our listener. What does this whole Gilded Age political picture look like? It seems like you have, on one hand, a national political structure that's kind of paralyzed by old Civil War loyalties, increasingly beholden to corporate money, and mostly just fighting over these big, abstract economic concepts like the gold standard and tariff levels.
Right. Lots of legislative gridlock at the federal level, especially on issues affecting ordinary people's economic lives.
But then down on the local level, particularly in the cities, you have this incredibly efficient, albeit deeply corrupt, system of machine that was actually delivering basic social services in its own way.
It really highlights this profound structural tension in the era. On one side, you had incredibly concentrated economic power, the industrialists, the bankers, the creditors, generally favoring gold, high tariffs, and limited government intervention.
The forces of stability, maybe?
Or inertia, depending on your perspective. And then on the other side, you had the growing demands of ordinary citizens, especially farmers, facing debt and deflation, and the urban poor facing precarious city life. And they were desperately demanding a stronger, more active governmental role to mitigate all that economic suffering and inequality.
And that tension, that clash between concentrated economic power and the demands from below, it really defined the political landscape, didn't it? Not just then, but for generations to come.
Absolutely. It set the stage for the progressive era and beyond.
Now, it's clear the populists, as a party, ultimately failed, right? They didn't win the presidency in 92 or 96 with Bryan. They didn't achieve lasting legislative control.
As a party, yes, they faded relatively quickly after 1896.
But their ideas,
Mm-hmm.
reading through that Omaha platform again, those ideas certainly didn't just disappear.
No, they absolutely didn't. And maybe here's a final provocative thought for you, the listener, to consider. Look back at that radical Omaha platform from 1892. All those demands that were considered dangerously socialist or wildly impractical at the time.
Government ownership of railroads, graduated income tax, direct election of senators.
Right. Think about which of those specific revolutionary demands for a stronger, more responsive, more participatory government ultimately became law in the subsequent decades.
Well, we did get a graduated income tax with the 16th Amendment. We got the direct election of senators with the 17th Amendment. Some railroad regulation eventually happened too, though not full ownership.
Exactly. So what does it tell you about the long-term viability, the long-term impact of movements born out of real economic hardship? Even if the Populist Party itself failed in the short term, many of its core ideas, ideas that seemed impossible in the 1890s, were eventually adopted into the mainstream. It shows us, I think, that even failed movements can permanently shift the boundaries of what's considered politically possible. Their echoes lasted a long, long time.